best not to ask who or why.
It's what I researched for all these years, Ada. And I see the symptoms already showing in your eyes.
Separate Ways, in my opinion, is not only one of the best expansion packs for a Resident Evil video game, I actually think that it's one of the best expansions of any video game ever that I've personally played. And when the Resident Evil 4 Remake came out earlier this year, the Separate Ways DLC was sorely missing, and I've been looking forward to it for a very long time, and I honestly thought it was going to take a lot longer than this to come out, but here we are months later after that initial release, and Separate Ways just came out today, and I just played it. I'm going to review it for you guys, give you my first impressions on it. Again, I'm going to review it for you, show you some raw gameplay, but before I do that, you should consider subscribing. I absolutely love Resident Evil. I talk about it all the time on this page. I actually have a dedicated playlist to Resident Evil on this channel. I reviewed the remake, I did an unboxing for the collector's edition, I talked about the third-person expansion for Resident Evil 8 Village, I even did a movie review for Resident Evil Death Island. I just love Resident Evil, and I love talking about all new Resident Evil content. So again, just consider subscribing if that seems interesting to you, or if you just want to support a fellow fanatic of Resident Evil. But I also talk about other horror video games on this page. But I also do trailer reactions, I talk about TV shows, I talk about movies, and mostly everything that I do leans towards horror. But enough of this intro, let's talk about Separate Ways. So first things first, this video is going to include some spoilers, but not a lot of spoilers. The gameplay that you're seeing is only from the first half of this expansion, and when it comes to story stuff, I'm not really going to talk about the story much at all, honestly. But depending on how this video performs, I will make a follow-up video getting more in-depth about my thoughts on the story and talking about more late game specific elements. But anyway, the first thing I want to talk about is the gameplay, but I'm not going to talk about every single aspect of the gameplay, because if you played the base game, you'd realize that this expansion is more or less more of the same. And that's not a bad thing, but if you want to see me get in depth about the core elements of the gameplay, you should go watch my review for the base game. But don't get me wrong, there are a lot of new elements in Separate Ways that make the gameplay feel fresh and different and distinct. There's a good handful of new weapons, including a new shotgun, a new explosive arrow, which is really fun to use. And you are Ada Wong after all, so of course you get to use your grappling hook. And it's fun going around and exploring the same map, but having a grappling hook at your disposal. I kind of wish you got to use it a bit more organically, because as you're exploring this map, there's a lot of paths that were originally open in the base game that are now blocked, and you have to use your grappling hook to get across and to get through and to get from point A to point B a lot of times. It just feels kind of forced. I kind of wish that they kind of incorporated it again in a more organic, fluent way. One of the big differences I noticed about this expansion when comparing it to the base game in terms of combat is there's a much stronger emphasis on stealth and then balls to the wall action, and there's not a lot of middle ground. For example, when you're exploring around, when you're getting from point A to point B, the game puts you in some very specific spots where you should use stealth. Like, there'll be a lot of enemies with their back to you, and it's very quiet, and it's just obvious that the game wants you to take them out stealthily. And then there's a lot of moments in this expansion where if you fire your gun once, suddenly there's 100 enemies coming at you. Not actually 100, but almost 100 in a lot of spots. So when you're playing through this expansion, it's either stealth or action. There's not a lot of those middle ground elements. And to be clear, this isn't me complaining. This is just me noticing a difference. Now let's talk about the locations in Separate Ways. And as you'd expect, the vast majority of locations in this expansion are just copied and pasted from the base game. You're gonna see a lot of the same places over again. But again, I feel like I'm gonna say this a lot in this review. That's not a critique, it's just me pointing it out. Again, this is an expansion, it's not a brand new thing. But the way you go about exploration and the pacing of gameplay is what really makes things feel fresh. Again, you're gonna recognize a lot of the same areas, but it's not gonna feel fully copy and pasted because your Ada, the pacing of gameplay is different. You enter rooms different ways, you exit rooms different ways. It's enough to make it feel fresh. I kind of wish that they did include more unique areas specifically created for this expansion. Same with enemy types and bosses. Some are reused as you'd expect again, but the way you fight them is different, and that's pretty exciting. For example, El Gigante, he's one of the main bosses in the base game. You fight him several times and you fight him again here, but the way you fight him is very, very different than any way you fought him before, so it's kind of a give and a take. It's the same boss yet again, but the way you fight him and where you fight him is just very different, and it's enough, at least for me personally, to feel different, to feel fresh, for me to not really complain. But don't get me wrong, there are a good handful of surprises in this expansion when it comes to enemies, when it comes to bosses, and when it comes to location. Not gonna spoil anything for you, but there's a decent amount of surprises. More than the original version of Separate Ways, if I'm remembering correctly. Again, no spoilers, but there were some stuff cut from the base game that I was super sad to see weren't included in that base game. But I quickly realized they probably weren't including it in the base game because they were going to include it in Separate Ways. And that made me excited because I thought it would make Separate Ways feel more fresh, more unique, not a lot of the same rehashed things. And I was half correct and half incorrect because there were some stuff that was cut that I was super happy to see was included here, but there was a couple other things that were cut from the base game that weren't here, and that just really disappoints me. The characters in this expansion are also really good. Luis plays a huge role in this expansion, more than he played in the original version of Separate Ways, and getting more Luis is always a good thing. He's probably my favorite supporting character in any Resident Evil game ever, and I'm so happy to see that his role was expanded upon in this version of Separate Ways. And here's where I'm going to say what a lot of people might consider a spoiler, but you do learn this pretty early in the game, so fast forward about a minute if you don't want to hear me say what I'm about to say regarding a specific character. 3, 2, 1, here we go. But I am so hyped that Albert Wesker was actually a character in this expansion. He was a character in the original version too, but he was basically Ada's version of Hunnigan, where he would only contact you through the radio. But in this version of Separate Ways, he's actually there. He's actually in the village. He's actually boots on the ground character. And that is so exciting for hardcore Resident Evil fans such as myself. Now, unfortunately, I am going to get into some critiques. The first being, yes, it doesn't get much better here, but Ada Wong's voice acting is still hollow, still kind of lifeless and emotionless. I was hoping it would get better here, and in some ways it does, but I think it only feels like it gets better because you spend more time with her. But at the end of the day, the voice acting is still kind of disappointing. But I cannot stress this enough, people who are bullying the voice actress are just huge losers. I really don't think it's the voice actress's fault. I truly, genuinely think it's the way she was directed. But my biggest critique with this expansion is that the pacing feels off. The pacing is very weird. Obviously, this isn't a full base game. You're not going to explore every single aspect of the map in a very fluid, organic way, but I kind of wish going from point A to point B felt more organic than it does here. There's a lot of times where Ada is one place and then it fades to black and then it fades back in and she's on a completely different part of the map and just time goes by. It's just really awkward. It makes the pacing very weird. It makes you feel like you're still not getting the full story. Again, I understand that this expansion shouldn't be 20 hours long. I understand that it's not going to be as in-depth as a full game, but I wish that, again, just the blending of chapters was just more organic than it is here. But at the end of the day, what was good in the original version of Separate Ways is still good here. This is, in my opinion, a better version of Separate Ways. It does everything that the original version did, everything that made the original version so iconic, and just expands upon it here. But also, we're in 2023, so part of me feels a bit underwhelmed, but that's just because the original version of Separate Ways was so ahead of its time. It was a PS2 game or a GameCube game, depending on which console you played it on. And getting something like Separate Ways tacked on to an already amazing base game wasn't very common back then. But now we're in a day and age where practically every single player game has pretty impressive expansion packs. Just look at the expansion packs for The Witcher 3 or Phantom Liberty for Cyberpunk 2077. 7 or some of the expansions for like Fallout 4 or something like that. When you compare this version of Separate Ways to those expansions, yeah, it feels kind of underwhelming and it feels kind of disappointing, but it's still really, really, really good. And in my opinion, it's well worth the $10, and I'm honestly kind of considering it this way. Resident Evil 4 Remake, when it came out, was only $60, when the vast majority of AAA games these days are $70. So if you take the $10 price tag of Separate Ways and you tack it on to the $60 price tag of the base game, and you just consider the game to be $70 like every other AAA single player game, it, the math checks out, in my opinion. Well, there you have it. There's my brief and quick thoughts on the new Separate Ways expansion for Resident Evil 4 Remake. Have you played it yet? Are you excited to play it? Are you not interested to play it? Let me know in the comments. And once again, consider subscribing, and thank you for watching, especially if you watched this far.